seems like a good time to start. Obviously, these talks that we've had this week and next week have been short and sweet and punchy. So if we can try and do the same thing again and finish in about half an hour. So firstly, welcome to the sixth in this series of Ensham Nature Recovery Network Tiny Talks. So this has been our little local 2-week festival, if you like, of hearing from experts in all kinds of manners of environment and ecology and natural history. So I've had the pleasure of doing one myself. My name is Neil. I'm a local resident and I work in conservation. And we know that this series of talks has attracted people from outside the parish, from other areas of Oxfordshire. So if any of you are from far away, if you like, welcome. And I've asked to say something really quickly by Katrina about the Nature Recovery Network. So it's really a kind of sort of decentralized network of local people who have come together in Ensham to try and tackle the biodiversity crisis by doing small but cumulatively important things within our village to make it more permeable and a better place for nature to be, basically. So many people have contributed. It's a burgeoning movement almost. More and more people are joining in. But I think we all have to give credit to Katrina and Kevin for being the kind of real driving forces of getting it going in the first place. And if you want to know more, if you look on YouTube, look up Ensham Nature Recovery Network. There's a really good webinar which was hosted a couple of weeks ago, and it will give you lots of information about not only what we've done but how we did it, and some tips and pointers for what you can do in your own parishes if you're not local. So I'll move straightly on to tonight's talk. So tonight's speaker is Sarah Couch, and the title is Fighting for Trees, Going the Extra Mile to Save Important Trees. So Sarah is another local resident, and she has a professional background in architecture and also in the conservation of historic landscapes. She's got a particular interest in management and conservation of trees in heritage landscapes, and she's also well published on the subject as well. Apart from asking you if you have any questions, to use the chat function. So those of you that aren't like ultra familiar with Zoom, you look at the bottom bar there, there's a little speech bubble where it says chat. Press that, type in your comment or your question for Sarah, and I'll do my best to monitor them. And once we've heard from Sarah, we will put questions to her. So without further ado, over to you, Sarah.
Hi. I'm just going to share my screen. So thank you so much for asking me to join this fantastic little series of all these experts we have around us. And this talk is going to follow on to some extent from a piece that I wrote for Nature Recovery on ancient trees. But this is more about some special memorable examples of fighting for trees, what I've had to do in various projects to save trees. And I'm going to start with 3 examples and increasing levels of action to save the trees. And then in the second part, I'm going to talk about my pet subject, which is avenues and the trees for avenues and what's threatening them and what we can do. Now, this starts with a really devastating picture. Believe me, it all gets better. But it's important because when I started doing this work, when I trained in conservation, and it was in 1990. So we just have these huge storms in the south of England, millions of trees lost. And 2 good things came out of that. One was that for the first time in a coordinated way, there was funding to study and research historic landscapes and put together management plans. My very first project was an avenue project following the storms. The other thing which is really interesting is that research found that the woodlands that have been damaged, if they were left just to regenerate naturally, they did much better than where people had gone in and planted trees. So there's always something to learn. So the first little story I'm going to tell you is, again, one of my very early projects. It's a park down in Surrey, which is owned by a slightly unusual institution. It's a local authority boarding school. And it's a beautiful park, Capability Brown Park. And within it, there were a series of gardens, and some of them were very, very overgrown. Now, I have to make a confession here. In working in historic landscapes, a lot of it is to do with trees, understanding what's important. And sometimes it does involve removing trees, self-sown trees. So in this example, this was a Japanese garden. The telltale sign is the base of a Japanese lantern here, but it was very much overgrown with self-set ash trees. Now, of course, ash trees are actually removing themselves at the moment, which is very sad for our woodlands. But in this case, somebody I trained with had offered the chance of being part of a television program. People got quite excited, quite scared, but luckily we knew a lot about the place, done the research, done the survey work. And so for 5 days, we had the television crew set loose, and here they are clearing some of the trees. But what I want to tell you about is an argument that broke out between the presenters, and you can see the two presenters and two real professionals in the hard hats. There's a detail of them. The guy in the red hat he's our wonderful tree surgeon, and the woman in the white hat was the person who lived on site and had started the whole project and did the real work, leading a band of volunteers. And those two are trying to persuade the two presenters that a ginkgo tree behind them, or behind me, was worth saving. They felt that it was looking a bit sad and it should go with the rest of the trees. In the meantime, some of the other presenters, there's somebody here you might recognize, was stuck in the mud, uncovering bits of Japanese lanterns. But the good news is that wonderful Ted Powell climbed up this ginkgo tree and gave it some tender loving care and saved it. So it was just a case of arguing and having the right skills. Ginkgo tree, you will know, is actually not Japanese, it's Chinese, but they had a very loose interpretation of what was Japanese at the time. In the wider park at Gatton, as I say, it had been landscaped by the wonderful Mr. Capability Brown, but he had kept some much older trees, and there were some fantastic ancient oak trees. These could be 500 or 600 years old, probably the remnants of old field boundaries. And you might just see in the distance some horses here. The school had a stables, and they actually used this area as their main grazing. And the horses had a wonderful habit of nestling up against the trees, rubbing themselves up against the trees, compacting the earth underneath the oak trees. Not a good idea for ancient trees. So here it was a case of changing management. And luckily this was part of a stewardship project, and fences were put up around the trees to protect them, gradually getting a wider area of protection so that you weren't getting the compaction and the damage. And also the grazing regime was changed. The horses were moved, and it changed to borrowing next door's sheep to graze after a hay crop and cattle, and it's beginning to look like parkland again. This next project, we had to go even further. It wasn't just the argument, and I have to say I'm not an arboriculturalist, and all of these projects involved many, many other people. But what happens is very often you would have a BS tree survey, the standard tree survey, and then I would go through it and do my own analysis and work out what trees were important in terms of the historic designed landscape. And this is Crystal Palace Park. This is where Crystal Palace ended up after the Great Exhibition. And Joseph Paxton designed this extraordinary Versailles-like place with its fountains, dinosaurs still survive down here, dinosaur statues. But what I want to tell you about is up in this corner here was an area called the English Landscape Garden. And I knew from doing my analysis that actually there were only about 30 trees surviving from the time that Joseph Paxton laid out this park in the middle of the 19th century. So any surviving trees were quite important. Paxton lived in the park at the top of the hill in a nice Regency villa called Rock Hills, and this overlooked the park, and he would have seen this tree and almost certainly planted this tree, this beech tree, on a mound, which was a favourite planting technique at the time. But after the BS survey, it was one of those ones marked red or U. It was there to be removed. It didn't have much of a safe life. But having explained to people that I thought it was a particularly significant tree, extra testing was done. Pica's sonic tomograph, which is like an ultrasound to detect decay, was done, and found that actually it wasn't in such a bad state, so that tree survived. And my third memorable example is Pitshanger Manor and Park in Ealing. And some of you will have heard me talk about this before. And in this case, much more was done to save these two trees. These were cedars that were probably planted about 1750 before Soane built his beautiful Pitshanger Manor country house. And they performed a very important function in framing the view between the manor house over the Serpentine Lake to the park and vice versa. That relationship had largely been lost, partly because of changes to the park. Sorry. And you can just see one of the cedars here. And there were 2 cedars and 2 lime trees. Now, we had lottery funding for this project, and the case officer was very supportive to do a lot more testing on these trees because they had been surveyed and they had safety concerns and they were all due to be felled. And the cedars are quite remarkable trees, and we were getting used to the idea, well, maybe they couldn't be saved. But we had funding to do quite a lot of extensive testing. So the Pica's tomograph was done again. These are little sensors. And what you get from that is a scan. And if you can see the brown areas, those are the areas of sound wood. So you can see very little sound wood, how at one point in the trunk, but actually a tree can live with only part of its trunk intact. And also a stress test was done, which is really loading up the trees to try and push them over and see how much wind load they can take. And that showed that with some measures in place, the trees could be saved, but that they wouldn't last forever. No trees last forever. However, it also gave time to propagate from them so that there are trees growing in nurseries that will be genetically identical to the trees in the park. And that's really important because in certain species, we know that the clones and the material, the actual genetics are different. And we want the trees to be able to produce the same kind of habit if we have to replace them. And here you can see work, sorry, it's jumping around. Here you can see work in progress. And this is one of the cedars, the other cedar and a lime. And quite a lot of the crown was reduced, but it grew back really well. And some other structural work. You can see there was a path here. This was taken away to reduce the competition and the compaction around the bottom of the trees, and new planting areas made around here so that the rooting conditions were much better and keep people away, and also to aerate the roots and to add beneficial mycorrhizae, the fungi that help trees. So I'm glad to say those trees are still there, and they're now framing the function of providing that function of framing the view and looking back to the manor house. So in each of those cases, we had to go a little bit further. But now I'm going to return to my favorite subject, which is avenues. And this is where I started. It was my original dissertation, and I've done quite a few avenue management plans. And this is some work for the Royal Parks. If you know Bushy Park, it's right next to Hampton Court, and the Chestnut Avenue is about 2 miles long, goes straight through the middle of the park. And on a brief look, it doesn't look too bad. But there were problems here. But before I go on to that, I want to explain that in the great period of avenue planting, which was mid-17th century to early 18th century, there were 3 species that were used before any others. The first 2, and by far the most popular, were lime and a particular clone of common lime and elm. And the third, which is what you can see here, is horse chestnut, which was much more of a French fashion. Here there were 4 rows each side of common lime, and then an inner row of horse chestnut, which were planted in the 1690s. and some of the original trees are still there because we know from ring counts after the storms. So some of these are 300-year-old chestnuts, which is really quite unusual. But sadly, there is a very nasty disease affecting horse chestnuts, which doesn't get anything like as much publicity as ash dieback. But for designed landscapes, it's more critical because horse chestnuts were used in design specific planting, whereas ash is more of a woodland tree. And this is a bacterial canker called bleeding canker, and it affects trees of all ages to different extents. Some of the older trees seem to be more resilient, but there is a gradual loss of trees. But one thing that was quite noticeable is around the circle, which is around the Diana fountain, there were much younger trees, more recent replacements, and they were suffering much worse, which is interesting, partly because they haven't got so much trunk, so girdling of the trunk is quicker, but there may be genetic differences too that are playing a role. And this is what bleeding canker looks like. You get sort of big plates on the old horse chestnut, which happens to horse chestnuts anyway, but the telltale sign is this oozy black staining that you get. And as I say, it's very often fatal. Don't confuse it with leaf miner moth, which you will see discoloring leaves on horse chestnuts. And that is more common and isn't fatal. It might weaken them a bit, but it's the bleeding canker that is killing horse chestnut trees in their droves. There isn't a general treatment. However, there is a treatment that is being promoted, in fact, by the horticulturist who worked at Crystal Palace Park, which is injecting the tree with garlic allicin. He calls the method Canker, very ingeniously. And it was interesting to hear Sue Chapman talking about injecting the elms in Ensham, which didn't work. This sometimes does work, but it's quite expensive, and I don't think anyone has done it at scale, and some people think it puts more stress on the trees. I just had a quick look on Google Street View to see how the avenue is doing. I did this report a few years ago, and you can see there are now massive gaps in the horse chestnuts. And it's a real problem here because this avenue is called Chestnut Avenue. And since the 19th century, since Victorian times, there's been a big festival in May called Chestnut Sunday. Can you do that if you don't have chestnut trees? What is the answer? Do you just manage decline, which is what's happening at the moment? Some point you've got to make a decision. We're not going to have chestnuts, or we're going to plant maybe sweet chestnuts. Something to consider, although there are diseases out in the wings that can affect sweet chestnuts too. Maybe other aesculus. It's a difficult one, but the good news here is that there is not just the chestnuts, there are 4 rows of limes. Limes, I said, are one of the 2 top avenue trees, and limes at the moment are really quite resilient. They are not affected by a lot of the diseases which are becoming much more prevalent, partly to do with climate change. And again, we did a lot of research and genetic testing at Newcastle University to work out which of these trees were original and original clones, so we knew what the genetics were, and which should be protected and which to propagate from. And trees can survive with very little trunk. So there's just a little skeleton, but they're still living, important trees. Finally, I'm going to talk about the most important tree that we have lost, the elm. And again, Sue Chapman mentioned how many elms were lost in Ensham. They were the predominant landscape tree, and you'll see them in Constable paintings. You'll see them here. This is the park at Pitshanger Manor around 1900. Very distinctive shape. But they weren't just parkland trees. They were used very widely for avenues. And the reason that limes and elms were very popular was partly to do with their shape, but partly because of the way they could be produced. They sucker, and so you can grow them, you can propagate them from suckers, and again, they're genetically identical, so you can produce at scale trees that will have the same form and growth habit. Blenheim was the huge avenue, the Grand Avenue at Blenheim, that I'm sure you'll know, with the column in it. That was originally lime and a very geometric formation. And this is actually a second planting in elm. I hope I said elm, I meant elm. In elm in about 1900. Amazing geometry. And what we have now is a third planting in lime. And another elm avenue, and this is a project that I did work on, management strategy for the trees at Christchurch. The Broad Walk, which is the walk that you enter when you come in from St Aldate's through the Memorial Garden, the big walk, was an elm avenue. And this is really early. This is about 1660, right at the cutting edge of avenue planting here. And it was quite a narrow elm avenue. And in the 70s, Dutch elm disease, they declined, and it was decided not to replant on the same line, but to plant groups of plane trees, which was, you know, it's an approach, but it doesn't really feel like an avenue anymore. So we looked at options. Elm, obviously, most of them have died, but there is good news and there is some hope for elms. And there has been a bit of a sort of trend for this kind of work to keep planting lime because we know it's safe. There are already 2 lime avenues at Christchurch. We wanted to try and look at something else. And one thing we've learned from all these diseases is that you need variety and diversity of trees. So what's happening with elms? Well, there are some old English elms that are resistant to Dutch elm disease. There are some down in Brighton, although one of the large ones has recently succumbed, but they've been surviving there. You can tell an elm tree, and you will see them suckering in hedgerows, regrowth. They don't get to big trees, but you will see young elms. At the base of the leaf, you will see it's got an uneven leaf base, and that's how you can identify, an easy way of identifying elm. There's a very famous elm in Sheffield. You might have heard of the Sheffield tree campaign, and thousands of trees were felled because of a new tree management contract. One of them in Nether Edge is this wonderful elm tree in Chelsea Road. Huge effort to save it. I have a friend who lives around the corner. He tells me the tree is still alive and well. So there are some old trees that seem to have resistance and people are propagating from them. So that's one source. But also there are some new, very highly resistant varieties of elm tree. And one of the reasons we know about them is because elm is the chosen food source for this butterfly, the white letter hair streak butterfly. So at Christchurch, we were able to source a whole range of some of these new elm varieties, which are being planted as a trial to see which do well, which develop the right kind of form as an option for future replanting. And this one here was one of our favourites. When we knew it, it was called, I think, FL593 or something, but it now has a name. It's the Wingham elm, after a village in Kent where the person who introduced it lived. So there is hope in trying to reintroduce one of our best loved trees. And I think we should get planting some elms in Ensham. I think I've had my 20 minutes and a little bit, so thank you. Brilliant.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Fascinating talk, as always. I think the bar's been raised a little higher again this evening. There's a few questions there for you. So I will start with one from Renee Watson, which is kind of a two-parter. Renee wants to know, what is the most common route for disease transmission in trees? And I think that was in the context of you talking about several species being readily cloned. So she asks, does the genetic homogeneity make the trees more susceptible to disease?
Ooh, I mean, the vector, well, Dutch elm disease is a beetle. That's how they spread. I'm not a geneticist. I can't tell you that, but I do know that, as I say, some of the older trees do seem to show resistance. Why? I don't know if anyone knows exactly what it is, but I think what I'm saying is it's important to keep that gene pool so that we have the choice and the range of trees that we can use.
Okay. Thank you. And then from Kelsey Monteith, in regards to the recent drive for reforestation as a response to climate change, how can we ensure that we preserve the trees that we have, but also ensure that we plant more trees and in the right places? So I guess that's a question about the right tree, right place mantra. I think
Yes.
we're all quite divided as to whether we should plant lots and lots of trees, and
Yeah.
I'm on the side of natural regeneration under most circumstances.
I think everything that I learned, natural regeneration is the better route, but people like to do something. They feel like, and also I think planting small trees, the less digging, the better as well, in terms of releasing carbon. Yeah, there's quite a debate about that. I think starting from what grows well locally, but I do think we're going to have to start introducing new trees and new varieties, because I mean, there's been some interesting studies by the Forestry Commission of how quickly conditions are changing. And there was a prediction a few years ago that it's not going to be too long before we cannot grow, or beech trees in the south of England will not survive. Trees cannot move as quickly as the climate is changing. And so we might need to take some positive action to introduce more resilient species, Southern European species. And I think we need to have a slightly more open mind. I know there's a very strong view that native is always best, but I think, as I say, things are changing so fast in terms of the climate that we need to be quite open about what we can grow. The other thing is, I think at the moment, one of the most resilient trees seems to be sycamore. And if you allow sycamore space to grow, it is the most beautiful tree. And I think we should learn to love sycamore.
Brilliant. And then kind of on a related topic, I'm going to be cheeky and use my privilege and ask one of my own. So you said you were talking about a beech tree in Parkland, which was assessed to not have much safe life left. Mm-hmm. It seems to me as an ecologist that 99% of our trees are euthanized in this country. So it's very, very rare that they're allowed to just fall over and die and become decrepit. Do you think we should be a little bit more relaxed about safety concerns? I know it's difficult in urban areas or pretty parklands, but trees out in the middle of nowhere, why aren't we letting more of them fall over and die? Because they can offer habitat for another couple of 100 years, can't they?
I think there are places, yeah, I think in some places that's the right thing. Not necessarily, next to a path that lots of people are using. I mean, one thing that's changed is that more parks are closing when there are very high winds, for instance. I mean, you can't remove all risk, but rather than saying these trees are not safe in a high wind, well, maybe say sometimes don't come here in a high wind. I mean, there are ways and ways of managing it. It's a bit like water, you can't say that water's always safe. There are risks. People have to have a judgment on risks. But it's the difficult thing with trees is once somebody has had a survey done and the safety issue has been raised, it's very difficult for managers to, well, I mean, it's an insurance issue. How can they accept that risk? It's managing the risk. And that's why in some of those examples, we've had to go to the extent of doing a lot of testing.
Great, thank you. On the subject of testing, Katrina wants to know, can Automograph be done through Ivy?
I don't see why not. But I would have to ask the experts. But I mean, it goes through the trunk, so why wouldn't it go through Ivy? Don't know. I suppose it depends on getting the good connection, But yeah.
Okay.
Why not?
And then there's a couple on your favourite subject of avenues. So Tricia Crowley asks, is there any evidence to suggest that tree avenues slow traffic speeds?
Oh, trees and safety. Well, I think I remember reading in France, because you know in France there are lots and lots of tree-lined roads, and they started removing them because they said they were dangerous, that they caused accidents. But maybe it should be the opposite way around. I would like to think so. I mean, I think it changes the feel of a road. So if you think of is it Sutherland or Sunderland Avenue? Sutherland Avenue. It feels more like a bit of a boulevard, or you know. So it feels as though you're sort of intruding on a different kind of space. So hopefully that does make people want to slow down.
Okay, and then what do you think about sweet chestnut as an avenue tree? That comes from Caroline Knight.
Well, it can work quite well as an avenue tree. Naturally, it's a very broad tree. I do know some historic avenues where they've been planted quite close together, and they grow up, but they're never very even. They're always, as you know, as they get old, they get sort of twisted, lovely twisted trunk. They're quite characterful trees. I think they probably work best in a very wide avenue, where they're making more of a vista. I think that can be very successful. So, for instance, at Bushy Park, they would make a perfectly fine avenue. But if it's a narrow avenue where you're looking at the trunks, they're not quite so suitable because they're characterful.
Okay, thank you. And then there's a question, Katrina again wants to know, do we have evidence that rising temperatures, climate change is affecting the growth rate of native species?
I don't know. I don't know about growth rate. Sorry, you've rumbled there. Okay. I mean, obviously, if if a tree is stressed from drought, that's going to affect it. I mean, certainly, if you look at tree rings, if you look at a slice of a tree, you can. One of the ways, as you probably know from dendrochronology, of dating things is by matching the growth in the tree ring against climate records and vice versa. So there's certainly, there is a correlation, yeah. But whether anyone studied that specifically in relation to climate change, I don't know. Recent climate change, but historically, yes, actually, yes, definitely. You can see that.
Okay, thank you. And I think that is the majority, or in fact, all of the questions that we've been asked. So it's a little after 8 o'clock. If anyone's got any final burning questions, now is the time. Otherwise, I think Sarah deserves another well-deserved remote round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Sarah. That was brilliant.
Lovely to see all your friendly faces.
It's been another great evening, really good series of talks. So my final job really is to say, if you are available at 7:30 tomorrow night, then join in again. So tomorrow is Linda Wishart, another local. She is a psychotherapist, and the title of her talk is Look, Listen and Lament, Grief and the Loss of Biodiversity. So that sounds pretty fascinating. So hopefully we'll see some of you back here again tomorrow night. And in the meantime, enjoy your